The first time I realized my marriage was sexless. But he wasn't. It wasn't because I found lipstick. It was because my husband kissed me goodnight like a polite coworker, then walked into the bathroom with his phone, locked the door, and whispered a name that wasn't mine. Not my name. And the part that still makes my stomach twist? I didn't confront him. I just stood there in the dark, staring at our wedding photo, thinking, how do you accuse someone of cheating when they won't even touch you? But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've ever felt yourself fading inside a relationship you were supposed to feel safe in, follow this channel. These are the stories marriages hide, until someone finally says them out loud. My name is Hannah. I'm 29 now, and I'm going to tell you the story of how I married a man who treated intimacy like an inconvenience, while living a private life that didn't include me. Come close for this one. Because for a long time, I didn't even know what I was living through. I just knew I was disappearing. I grew up in a house where love wasn't a performance. It was normal. My dad still opens doors for my mom. Still buys her flowers for no reason. Still reaches for her hand in the grocery store like he's afraid someone might steal her. And they've been married forever. The kind of forever that makes people roll their eyes and say, must be nice. It was nice. It also ruined me a little. Because when that's your baseline, you don't just want love. You want a love that feels safe enough to build a whole life inside it. A home, kids, a kitchen table you actually eat at, a Christmas morning that doesn't taste like resentment. That was the dream. And I didn't realize how dangerous it is to want a dream badly enough that you'll ignore the person standing next to it. I didn't date a lot in high school. I wasn't sheltered. My mom was actually weirdly open about everything. Sex, boundaries, red flags. She was the kind of mother who would rather you cringe at her honesty than lie to her. But I was cautious. My first serious boyfriend cheated, and it rearranged something in me. It wasn't even the cheating itself. It was that hollow, humiliating thought afterward. Maybe I'm not the kind of woman men stay faithful to. I hate admitting that. I really do. But that insecurity is like a tiny crack in the foundation. You can live with it for years, until a whole house collapses through it. When I met Ethan, I was 27. I was working at a hospital, administrative side. He was on the clinical side. And yes, I know how that sounds already. Hospital romances, scrubs, adrenaline, long shifts, emotional bonding over cafeteria coffee and trauma. But what pulled me in wasn't drama. It was how calm he seemed. He had this quiet, controlled way of speaking. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't that guy trying to impress people in the break room with stories. He didn't flirt like a teenager. He didn't chase attention. He just watched. And when he did talk, it was with this gentle precision, like every word had been weighed first. I mistook that for maturity. Also, let me be honest, I was flattered that someone like him noticed me. I wasn't the hospital hot girl. I wasn't the loud one. I was the reliable one. The one who remembered birthdays, covered shifts, brought extra pens, knew everyone's allergies and coffee order. I was useful. And Ethan liked that. At first, it felt like he liked me. He didn't come from a warm, sprawling family like mine. His mom had passed when he was younger. His family was small, quiet, a little heavy, like grief lived there permanently, sitting in the corner like an uninvited guest. When I met his dad, the man was polite, but distant, like he was still bracing for another loss. Ethan would tell these stories about how he basically raised himself emotionally, how he learned not to need people, because needing people was how you get hurt. I should have heard that and thought, that's not romantic, that's a warning. But I heard it and thought, I can love him into safety. Yeah, I know, I'm cringing too. Our relationship moved fast. Not in a chaotic way, more like an efficient way. Like we were checking off boxes. We went from flirting to dating to moving in together like it was the natural order of the universe. And the first few months were good. Not fireworks. More like steady warmth. He didn't yell. He wasn't jealous. He didn't drink much. He didn't party. He didn't do anything obviously wrong. He was consistent. But looking back, there was a strange emptiness in the intimacy department. Not just physical, emotional too. When you date someone, you learn their rhythm. How they reach for you without thinking. How they pull you in when they're stressed. How they smile at you like they're grateful you exist. Ethan didn't do that. He wasn't cold exactly. He wasn't mean. He wasn't insulting. He was detached. And every time I noticed it, I explained it away for him. He had trauma. He had grief. He had a demanding job. He wasn't a touchy person. I told myself love could look like different things. I told myself I was being mature for not expecting Disney. And because I came from a family where men actually show affection, I didn't want to be the spoiled girl who complains about a husband who just isn't romantic. So I adapted. I became the initiator. I was the one who leaned in first. The one who tried to make him laugh. The one who planned date nights. The one who suggested trips. The one who offered massages. The one who brought up us. And for a while, it felt like effort. Like a normal relationship where one person is more expressive. Then, it started feeling like I was trying to warm up a statue. Here's a detail I used to avoid saying out loud, because it sounds too personal. But this channel isn't built for comfort, is it? A few months before the wedding, our sex life stopped. Not gradually. Not like, we've been busy. Not like a dry spell. Stopped. At first, I told myself it was stress. Planning, money, work, family expectations. The whole pre-wedding chaos. I even asked a married friend, casually, like I was gossiping, "Did you and your fiancé go through a weird phase before your wedding?" She laughed and said something like, "Oh yeah, we were exhausted. It'll come back." So I let it go. And Ethan didn't seem worried about it at all. That was the first time I felt that little flicker of alarm I didn't know how to name. Because most people, men included, don't just shrug off intimacy for months unless something's going on. But I didn't press. I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to sound insecure. I didn't want to be the woman who only cares about sex. So I did what I always did. I rationalized. And there's something else too. During that same time, I started managing everything. It's like my brain slid into this role without asking permission. I handled the vendor calls, the invitations, the payments, the schedule, the family communications, the logistics, the little emergencies. Ethan would help in ways that looked responsible from the outside, like he'd show up when needed, sign what I put in front of him, nod at decisions. But it was never his weight to carry. I carried it, and I remember telling myself it was fine because, honestly, I was good at carrying things. I'd carried my whole life. The night before our wedding, my dad pulled me aside. We were at the venue. People were running around. My mom was trying to hold back tears. My bridesmaids were doing that frantic, "We're having fun, but we're dying" energy. And my dad, my calm, steady, gentle dad, took my hands and looked me straight in the eye, and he said very quietly, "Hannah, if you don't want to do this, we can leave. Right now. You and me. We can turn around and walk out." It wasn't dramatic. He didn't accuse Ethan of anything. He didn't say I hate him. It was just an offering, a door. And for 1 second, my heart actually beat differently, because a part of me, some tiny buried part, had been waiting for someone to hand me an exit without making me feel like a failure. But I smiled at my dad and said, "No, this is what I want." And I believed it. Or maybe I believed the dream. I walked down the aisle and Ethan looked composed. Not teary. Not shaking. Not overwhelmed. Composed. He kissed me after the vows like you'd kiss a relative. Like you'd kiss someone in a photo op. Everyone clapped. Everyone cried. Everyone told me I was glowing. And I remember thinking, okay, this is it. This is the beginning. Now we can relax. Now we can be us. Our honeymoon was in Florida. Not some wild luxury trip. Just a nice hotel, beaches, restaurants, the kind of trip you take when you're trying to be practical. I bought lingerie. I felt ridiculous buying it, but I bought it anyway. I kept telling myself, it'll come back when we're away from stress. The first night, he said he was tired. The second night, he said he had a headache. The third night, he was still adjusting. By night 4, I stopped trying. Not because I didn't want him, because I didn't want the feeling of being rejected by my own husband in a hotel room I paid for to celebrate our marriage. So I did what I always did when I felt embarrassed. I became calm. I became pleasant. I became a cool wife. And that is exactly how women disappear. Not with screaming, with smiling, with telling themselves, it's fine, it's not that bad. At least he's not hitting me. At least he's not drinking. At least he's not. At least. When we got home, life settled into routine. Work, bills, laundry, groceries, and Ethan moved through our home like a man who was grateful for the stability, but not particularly interested in the person creating it. He didn't touch me much, not casually, not passing by, not pulling me in, not kissing my forehead, not sliding his hand around my waist. If I hugged him, his body would accept it, but not return it. It was like hugging someone who'd been taught affection is a chore. And the most confusing part? He wasn't cruel. If he had been cruel, I would have had clarity. If he had been violent, I would have had a label. If he had been obviously hateful, I would have had permission to leave. But he was quiet, functional, respectable. The kind of man people trust. The kind of man your friends would say, he seems so nice. And I was starting to feel crazy for noticing the emptiness. So I stopped talking about it. I started talking about normal married life things instead. Decorating. Money. Maybe kids soon. And that's when another pattern started. So slowly I didn't clock it as a pattern. His phone was always close. Always angled away. Always face down. And sure, lots of people do that. Privacy, work, habit. But with Ethan, it wasn't privacy. It was secrecy with a calm face, like he wasn't afraid of getting caught, like he'd already built a system where getting caught wasn't possible. I'd be cooking, and he'd step out to take a call. I'd walk into the room, and he'd end the conversation mid-sentence, not rushed, not panicked, just done. And then he'd look at me with that soft, steady expression and say, "Everything okay?" Like I was the suspicious one, like I was the unstable one. So I'd say, "Yeah, everything's fine," because I didn't want to be the paranoid wife, the insecure wife, the wife who ruins her own marriage with trust issues. Even though I wasn't jealous, I was lonely. There's a difference. And loneliness inside a marriage is its own kind of horror. You can't complain about it without sounding ungrateful. You can't prove it without sounding dramatic. You can't touch it without it slipping away, so you just live in it, quietly, until the quiet starts swallowing you. By the time I noticed the truth, really noticed it, I wasn't even shocked. I was tired of initiating, tired of hoping, tired of pretending I didn't notice how a man who didn't need intimacy somehow always had energy for his phone. And I want you to hold on to that, because the first time I heard him whisper someone else's name, it didn't feel like a plot twist. It felt like the missing puzzle piece sliding into place. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The night I heard her name, I wasn't snooping. That's important to me. I wasn't digging through drawers. I wasn't checking messages. I wasn't playing detective. I was brushing my teeth. We had gone to bed like usual, meaning we had turned off the lights, gotten under the covers, and positioned ourselves like polite roommates who respected each other's personal space. He had kissed my forehead, not my mouth, my forehead. Then he said, "I'm going to shower." It was almost midnight. He'd already showered after work, but I didn't question it. I was so trained not to question things by then. I finished brushing my teeth and climbed into bed. I remember checking the clock. 12:07 a.m. The water wasn't running. That's what made me pause. I sat up. The bathroom light was on. The door was locked. I could see the strip of light at the bottom, but no water, no movement. Just quiet. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Intimate. The kind of voice you don't use when you're talking to a coworker about a schedule change. The kind of voice you use when your guard is down. I slid out of bed without thinking. Not dramatically, not angrily. Just slowly. And I stood near the door. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. But once you hear your husband say another woman's name in a tone he's never used for you, you don't exactly walk away. Yeah, I know. I miss you too. The word miss didn't hit as hard as the tone. Soft, warm, alive. I had not heard that voice directed at me in months. Maybe longer. I felt something very strange in that moment. Not rage, recognition. Like my brain had been trying to solve a math problem for a year, and suddenly the answer appeared on the board. He wasn't uninterested in intimacy. He just wasn't uninterested in intimacy with me. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't burst in. I didn't cry. I just went back to bed, and I stared at the ceiling. When he came out 15 minutes later, he smelled like soap he didn't use. He got into bed beside me and said, "You okay?" That question again. Like I was the unstable variable. "Yeah," I said. And I meant it in the most terrifying way possible. I was okay. Because the confusion was gone. What replaced it was colder. The next morning, I didn't confront him. Instead, I waited. I watched. I listened. And for the first time since our wedding, I stopped trying to make the marriage feel alive. I became quiet too. You know what's fascinating? When you stop initiating affection with someone who isn't giving it freely, they don't suddenly chase you. They relax. It was subtle, but I saw it. He didn't reach for me to ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why I hadn't tried to hug him in days. He didn't comment on the distance. It was like I had removed a responsibility from him. And he was relieved. A week later, the opportunity to confirm everything landed in my lap without me having to search for it. We were driving to the bank. His phone was in the cup holder. Face up. That alone was unusual. It buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. I glanced down. Same name, over and over. 30 missed calls. My heart didn't race. It sank, like an elevator cable snapping. He reached for the phone quickly. Too quickly. "Work," he said. At 10:47 a.m. on a Saturday. "Emergency," he added. But he didn't answer. He silenced it. And in that split second, something inside me shifted permanently. That afternoon, while he was out running errands, I logged into our shared phone account, not because I wanted to spy, because I needed proof that I wasn't insane. 30 calls a day, some days more, at every hour. Morning, afternoon, late at night. Sometimes between midnight and 1 a.m. I felt heat rise to my face. Not because he was cheating, because I'd been trying to seduce a man who was spending that energy elsewhere. The humiliation is what gutted me. I called the number. My hands were steady. A woman answered. Bright voice. Confident. "Hello?" I didn't scream. I didn't insult her. I said calmly, "Hi. This is Hannah. Ethan's wife." Silence. Then a sharp inhale. And in that inhale, I knew she knew exactly who I was. There's a very specific silence that exists when 2 women realize they've been positioned against each other by the same man. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded irritated, like I was interrupting something. "I think you should talk to him," she said. Of course. I hung up, and for a few seconds, I just stood in the middle of my kitchen. The kitchen I had decorated. The kitchen where I had imagined feeding our future children. The kitchen where I had tried to cook meals to create warmth. And suddenly it felt like a set, like I'd been living in a stage play. When he came home, I didn't give him time to settle. "Who is she?" He froze, and that's when I saw it. Not guilt, not heartbreak, not fear of losing me, fear of inconvenience. He looked like a child who had been caught taking cookies. Not because he felt bad, but because he hadn't planned for this. "It's not what you think." Of course it was. I told him I called her. He sat down, ran his hands through his hair, sighed, and then said something I will never forget. It didn't mean anything. That sentence. That lie. It's always that one. Because if it didn't mean anything, then what did that say about the hours, the calls, the voice I heard, and what did that say about me? If it meant nothing, why wasn't I the one he wanted? I did something dramatic that night. Not screaming dramatic. Strategic dramatic. I took off my ring. I placed it on the counter. And I said, I'm leaving. Not as a threat. As a statement. He didn't chase me. He didn't beg. He said, you're overreacting. That word. Overreacting. I packed a bag, booked a hotel, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I was alone with my thoughts without having to manage his comfort. The hotel room was cold, too bright, too quiet. I sat on the floor instead of the bed. I don't know why. Maybe because beds felt symbolic of something I couldn't access. And here's the part that people struggle to understand when I tell this story. I didn't cry because he cheated. I cried because I realized I had married someone who was capable of building an entire emotional world outside of me, while letting me think I was asking for too much. That weekend, he texted. He called. He said he'd cut it off. He said he made a mistake. He said he didn't know how it got that far. He said he loved me. And I believed none of it. But I believed something else more strongly. I had just gotten married 4 months ago. 4 months. I had stood in front of my family and promised forever. I had walked down that aisle knowing my dad gave me an exit. And I chose this. I chose him. The shame of walking away that quickly felt heavier than the betrayal. And that's where the real trap set in. I told myself something that would cost me years. I can survive this. Not, I deserve better. Not, I will not tolerate this. I can survive this. It sounds brave. It isn't. Survival is not the same as living. When I went back home Sunday night, I didn't go back as a wife. I went back as someone with a plan. I made a decision so rational it terrifies me now. I decided I would stay. Not because I forgave him. Because I wanted children. I wanted a family. I wanted the image. I wanted the structure. I wanted the dream more than I wanted the man. And something in me shut down. The part that felt romantic love. The part that admired him. The part that respected him. It didn't explode. It didn't shatter. It just turned off, like flipping a light switch. From that point forward, I stopped trying to be desired. I stopped trying to win his attention. I stopped initiating sex. I stopped reaching for him. And here's the irony. He didn't notice. Because he had somewhere else to go. The marriage was sexless. But he wasn't. And I convinced myself I could compartmentalize it too. If he was going to live a double life, I would live a strategic one. I would build the life I wanted inside the shell of this marriage. I would have children. I would create stability. And then one day, when I was strong enough, I would leave. I just didn't know yet how much leaving was going to cost. After I chose to stay, something in me hardened. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly, like cement setting. From the outside, we looked stable, functional, respectable. Inside, we were two people running parallel lives that occasionally intersected for appearances. And the strangest part? There were no screaming matches, no broken plates, no slammed doors. There was just absence. We became efficient. He worked long hours at the hospital. I kept everything else running. Bills, groceries, social obligations, family visits, planning, and if I'm honest, I slid fully into a role that should have terrified me. I became his manager, not his wife. I handled finances, insurance, schedules, tax documents, investments, household decisions. He would hand me paperwork without reading it and say, "Just tell me where to sign." At the time, it felt like trust. Now I know it was convenience. I had become the operational backbone of his life, and he had outsourced intimacy somewhere else. There's a detail I need to say out loud, because it explains more than people realize. After the first affair was over, and by over I mean he promised it was over, we didn't rebuild intimacy. We didn't go to therapy. We didn't talk through what had happened. I didn't want to. People think that's strange, but I didn't want to fix it. I didn't want to repair something that I already felt had died. In a twisted way, withholding affection became my punishment. If you could betray me that easily, you don't get access to me anymore. So I removed myself. Physically, emotionally, sexually. And for months, nothing happened. No attempts from him to reconnect. No effort to revive anything. It was like we both silently agreed to stop pretending. That's when I realized something terrifying. He hadn't been uninterested in sex. He'd been uninterested in sex with me. Because the rumors at the hospital never stopped. Hospitals are ecosystems. Secrets don't stay buried long. They circulate, quietly, in break rooms, in whispers between nurses, in elevator conversations that stop when someone walks in. I started hearing things. Not direct accusations. Just, have you seen Ethan lately? He's been spending a lot of time on the surgical floor. Is he still married? That last one hit different. Is he still married? I was at home cooking dinner while women at his workplace were asking if he was still married. The humiliation was surgical, precise. But I refused to explode. Instead, I accelerated my plan. I wanted children. And if I was going to live inside a marriage that lacked intimacy, then at least I would extract something meaningful from it. I know how that sounds. Transactional. Cold. But I was already living inside something cold. So I matched the temperature. We had sex exactly once that year. Once. And I remember it clearly because it felt scheduled. Not romantic. Not spontaneous. Not hungry. Like two people fulfilling an obligation. I didn't feel wanted. I felt necessary. A month later, I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the positive test in the bathroom alone. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from intensity. This was it. This was the thing I had wanted my whole life. And I remember thinking, almost with relief, now the marriage has a purpose. When I told Ethan, he looked stunned, then pleased, then energized in a way I hadn't seen before. He wanted to be a father, and here's where the story gets complicated. He was a good father, attentive, present, gentle, engaged. When our daughter was born, something in him woke up. He held her like she was glass. He cried. He memorized her features. He rearranged his schedule to be home more often. And I watched him give tenderness to our child that he had never given to me. That realization was a different kind of wound. Because now I knew he was capable of softness. He just hadn't chosen me for it. Our life shifted entirely around our daughter. Night feedings, pediatrician visits, milestone videos, family photos. From the outside, we looked idyllic. Young parents, successful careers, healthy baby, beautiful home. And in many ways, I was fulfilled. Motherhood filled the space that romantic love had vacated. But the affairs didn't stop. They just evolved. He got smarter, more discreet. He compartmentalized better. The calls weren't as obvious. The messages weren't as frequent on shared accounts. But there were signs, always signs. A scent that wasn't mine. A shift in schedule that didn't align. A tone change when a certain coworker's name was mentioned. And every time I confronted him, he reacted the same way. Calm. Almost bored. You're reading into things. You're insecure. You're projecting. Projection. That word is powerful. It makes you question your own sanity. It makes you think maybe your instincts are the problem. So I did what high-functioning women do when they're being gaslit. I overperformed. I worked more. I cooked better. I organized harder. I made our home look magazine-ready. If he was going to betray me, he was going to do it inside a life I curated flawlessly. When our second child was born 2 years later, the dynamic solidified. We were co-parents, not lovers, not friends, not partners. Co-parents. Our conversations were about logistics. Did you schedule the dentist? Who's picking up from daycare? What time is your shift? And here's the strangest part. We rarely fought. People assume cheating equals chaos. But when intimacy is already dead, Cheating becomes background noise. There was no jealousy, because I didn't want him anymore. There was no possessiveness, because he hadn't belonged to me in years. What existed instead was something more dangerous: indifference. Indifference is what allows humiliation to survive. I would hear him on the phone while we were on vacation in Florida. Yes, while we were on vacation. He'd step onto the balcony and talk in low tones. And I'd sit inside the hotel room with our children asleep beside me and think, this is absurd. But I stayed, because I had built a mental narrative that made it make sense. He can have his distractions. I will have my children. He can live in compartments. I will live in purpose. And then something shifted again. Not because I changed, because another woman did. One of his affairs lasted longer than the others. Long enough to develop weight. Long enough to stop being recreational. She called me one afternoon while I was home with our youngest. Her voice was steady. I need you to know I'm with your husband. And I'm not planning to stop. There was no apology in her tone. No shame. Just clarity. And for the first time in years, I felt something hot. Not jealousy. Not heartbreak. Anger. Not at her. At him. Because he hadn't just cheated. He had made me live in a structure that was rotting from the inside while insisting it was solid. When he came home that night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I said, "How long?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Long enough. Long enough to matter. Long enough to feel real. Long enough that I was no longer the only woman in his emotional orbit. And here's where things get complicated again. I told him I would leave, and I meant it. I had my law school acceptance letter by then. Yes, while raising 2 children, while working part-time, while living inside a hollow marriage. I had enrolled in law school, not because I dreamed of arguing in court, because I knew one day I would need to leave, and I refused to leave powerless. He panicked, not because he was losing me, because he was losing stability. He begged, he promised, he cried, he said he'd end it, and I looked at him and realized something I had avoided for years. He didn't love me. He loved the system I maintained. The meals, the children, the house, the reputation, the image of a stable doctor with a devoted wife, and I had helped build that illusion. So when he said, "Please don't go," I heard, "Please don't dismantle the infrastructure." I stayed again, but not because I believed him, because I was waiting. I needed to finish my degree. I needed savings. I needed strategy. And I needed the moment when leaving would not destroy my children's lives. I told myself, just a few more years. Just get through school. Just build the foundation. I didn't know then that the foundation would collapse before I was ready. Because eventually, she stopped being patient. Eventually, she demanded more. And that's when everything detonated. But that is where the story takes a turn I didn't predict. And it's not subtle. It's violent in a way that has nothing to do with fists. Affairs thrive in shadows. They survive on secrecy, compartmentalization, stolen hours. But when someone drags them into the light and says, "Choose," everything changes. She chose. Not quietly, not patiently. She left her husband, moved out, and told Ethan she was done living in the margins. I didn't find out from him. Of course I didn't. She called me. Again. Her voice this time wasn't steady. It was sharp. I left my husband. I told him I'm with Ethan. He said he doesn't believe me. I need him to tell you it's real. There it was. The thing that had been happening in secret for years had now become someone else's ultimatum. When Ethan came home that night, I could feel it before he spoke. He didn't look guilty. He looked pressed, like a man standing between 2 doors that were both closing. I want a divorce. The words didn't shatter me. They unlocked something. I stared at him, and the strangest emotion flooded through me. Relief. Not because he was leaving. Because I didn't have to be the one to detonate the structure anymore. "Okay," I said. He blinked. That wasn't the reaction he expected. "Okay?" he repeated. "Yes." "Okay," I began listing practical things. We'll return the house to the bank. We'll split the cars. We'll create a custody schedule. I'll move out. He looked confused. You don't want to fight for this? Fight for what? The performance? The house that echoed? The intimacy that never existed? I stopped fighting 4 months into this marriage, I said quietly. He winced, because now the narrative was slipping. He wasn't the one bravely leaving a broken wife. He was the man who had been living a double life while his wife built his infrastructure. Then he said something that exposed everything. But, you still love me. It wasn't a question. It was an assumption. And I laughed. Not cruelly. Not hysterically. Just, honestly, I haven't loved you in years. Silence. And in that silence I saw it. He had never considered that possibility. He thought I was passive. He thought I was dependent. He thought I was enduring because I was weak. He had no idea I was enduring because I was planning. But here's the thing. He wanted the divorce. Emotionally. Socially. Sexually. He did not want the divorce legally. He didn't want the optics. He didn't want the public narrative. He didn't want to be the doctor who left his wife and 2 small children for a coworker. So he did something more insidious. He began acting divorced. Without being divorced. He started going out openly. Stopped hiding. Stopped pretending. He'd leave the house at night and not explain where he was going. He'd come home smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. And when I confronted him, he'd say, "You know I'm seeing someone. Why are you acting surprised? Because you are still legally my husband. Because our children are asleep upstairs. Because you are using my home as a waiting room between women." But he had reframed the narrative. To himself. In his mind, he had already left. Which meant he didn't owe me decency anymore. And that's when the humiliation escalated. One night, while getting dressed to go out, he stood in the doorway of our bedroom, holding 2 shirts. "Which one do you think looks better?" I stared at him. "For what?" "For dinner." "With who?" He tilted his head slightly. "Does it matter?" The cruelty wasn't loud. It was casual. That's what made it vicious. "I don't know," he continued. "She likes darker colors. He was asking me to help him choose an outfit to impress the woman he was leaving me for. Something in my chest went cold. "You can decide yourself," I said. He shrugged. "Don't be dramatic." Dramatic. There's that word again. He started asking which car he should take, which cologne. Once, he stood in the kitchen and said, almost thoughtfully, "We should redo this wine rack. She loves red wine." She. In my kitchen. In my house. The house we had purchased 5 months earlier. The house we had committed to paying off over 30 years. The house I had decorated. The house our children learned to walk in. He was renovating it in his head for her. And here's where the psychological part becomes clear. He didn't want me gone. He wanted me contained. He wanted the stability, the childcare, the reputation, the shared social circle, and the thrill. He wanted all of it. And when I told him I was taking the kids and leaving, that's when he lost composure. "No," he said flatly. "You don't get to decide that," I replied. "I'm not letting you take them. They're my children too. I know that." The argument escalated for the first time in 8 years. Real shouting. Real anger. Because now it wasn't about ego. It was about control. There was one night, I don't dramatize this lightly, when I packed small overnight bags for the kids. Nothing extreme. Just pajamas, toothbrushes, their favorite stuffed animals. I told him calmly, "We're going to my parents tonight." He blocked the doorway. Physically. Not violently, but intentionally. "You're not taking them." "I am." "No." The air felt thin. The children were upstairs, sensing something. I stepped around him. He grabbed my arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to stop me. And for a second, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not rage, fear. Fear of exposure, fear of narrative loss, fear of being seen as the villain. That night, my father came. My father who had offered me an exit at the altar. He walked into that house, calm but solid. He picked up his grandchildren, and he looked at Ethan in a way that said everything without words. That was the first time my family saw even a fraction of what had been happening. But the most brutal moment wasn't the hallway. It was the restaurant. It was Sunday, my parents' favorite place. We had gone there for years. Birthdays, celebrations, anniversaries. He knew that. He knew they'd be there. And he walked in, with her, hand on her back, guiding her, confident. He approached the table like he was introducing a new colleague. "Mom, Dad," he said to my parents. "This is Claire." Claire. Not ashamed, not hidden. Introduced. My father's face drained of color. My mother's hands started shaking, and I hadn't even told them yet that he'd asked for a divorce. They found out in that moment, publicly, humiliated alongside me. That was the moment I understood something clearly. This wasn't carelessness. This was narrative rewriting. He was staging his new life before the old one had officially ended. And he expected me to stand quietly in the wings. That's when I filed. Litigation. Contested. He didn't sign willingly. He stalled. He delayed. He tried to negotiate things that weren't negotiable. My lawyer advised me not to leave the house until papers were served. So I stayed. In limbo. Until the day she officially received notice. That Friday. The next morning, without telling him, I called a moving company. The truck pulled up on Saturday. He walked in from a night shift and froze. "What is this?" "I'm leaving." "You can't just..." "I can." He started pointing at furniture. "That stays. You're not taking that. She likes that. She." Again. I looked around the house. 7 televisions, custom cabinetry, wine storage, luxury appliances, and I realized something powerful. None of it mattered. "You see those 2 kids upstairs?" I said calmly. "That's what I'm taking. The rest can burn." The movers worked fast. He stood there, trying to assert ownership over objects, as if controlling furniture would reestablish control over me. I packed only what I could afford to keep: beds for the children, a refrigerator, a few boxes. I left behind the rest, because for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't surviving. I was choosing, and I didn't yet know that the next year would nearly break my body. But in that moment, loading my children into the car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not triumph, freedom, raw, uncertain, but mine. There's a strange stretch of time between we're getting divorced and actually being divorced. It's not marriage. It's not freedom. It's purgatory. For 40 days after he said he wanted a divorce, my life existed in that space. He behaved like a single man, but he still slept in our house. He still ate at our table. He still expected access to our children whenever he pleased. And he still refused to sign anything. Those 40 days were worse than the 8 years before them. Because before, at least, I had chosen to stay. Now I was trying to leave. And he was trying to control the exit. He went out almost every night. Not sneaking, not hiding. Openly. He'd shower, dress carefully, check himself in the mirror, and sometimes, still, ask me things that felt like psychological warfare. Is this too much cologne? Do you think this jacket makes me look old? I don't want to look tired. Tired. As if I hadn't been tired for years. I stopped answering. I would stand there silently while he inspected himself. And silence became its own form of defiance. But he wasn't satisfied with silence. He wanted reaction. One night, he leaned casually against the kitchen counter and said, "Claire thinks this house has good energy. Good energy. In the house where my children were sleeping upstairs. In the house I was preparing to leave. In the house he was still legally married inside." I looked at him and realized something chilling. He didn't see me as a person anymore. He saw me as an obstacle. An inconvenient step in a transition he had already emotionally completed. And that's when the arguments escalated. Not explosive. Controlled. He'd corner me in conversation and twist logic like it was elastic. You're the one who hasn't loved me in years. You made this marriage cold. You withheld intimacy. That last one almost made me laugh. Withheld intimacy? From the man who wouldn't touch me on our honeymoon? From the man who whispered another woman's name in our bathroom? But gaslighting doesn't work because it's believable. It works because it's relentless. Say something enough times, and even the most grounded person starts wondering if they missed something. I started recording conversations, not for drama, but for sanity, to replay them later and confirm I wasn't losing my mind. There was one night I'll never forget. It was after the restaurant incident, after my father nearly collapsed at the table when Ethan introduced her like she was an upgrade. My father had never interfered in my marriage before that night, but that evening, when we got home, he showed up at the house unannounced. He walked in slowly, calm, measured, and he looked at Ethan with a steadiness that felt heavier than anger. I gave her an exit once, my dad said quietly. You should have respected that. Ethan didn't respond. He just tightened his jaw. Because what do you say when a good man sees you clearly? That night, I told Ethan again, I'm leaving with the kids. He snapped. For the first time in 8 years, his voice rose. You're not taking them away from me. I'm not taking them away, I said. I'm removing them from chaos. This is your chaos. My chaos. I remember staring at him and thinking, you really believe that? That's the scariest part of men like this. They genuinely believe the narrative they rewrite. At one point, he locked himself in the office and refused to come out until I calmed down. I hadn't raised my voice. I had simply said, this is over. The children sensed everything. Children always do. My oldest started asking questions. Why is Daddy going out so much? Why are you crying at night? Because yes, I did cry. Not in front of him, but in the shower, in the car, in the laundry room while folding tiny pajamas. And one night, when the tension felt unbearable, I packed the children's overnight bags again. This time, I didn't argue. I called my father before Ethan got home. When Ethan walked in and saw the bags, something snapped in his composure. You're not leaving, he said. I am. You can't just take them. I can. He stepped into the hallway, blocking it, not violently, but intentionally. His presence filled the space. I saw calculation in his eyes. If he let me walk out, he'd lose control of the timeline. So he stood there. The children were upstairs, silent, listening. And that's when my father's car pulled into the driveway. The sound of that engine felt like oxygen. My dad walked in. No yelling, no threats. He picked up his grandchildren, looked at Ethan once, and said, we're leaving. That night was the first time I slept outside that house knowing I wouldn't go back permanently. But here's the part people don't talk about. Leaving doesn't feel triumphant. It feels terrifying. I moved into a small apartment I could barely afford, downsized from a gated home with 7 televisions to a place where I had to choose between buying groceries or replacing a broken appliance. He stayed in the house. With her. She moved in almost immediately, within days. The woman who had called me twice. The woman who gave him the ultimatum. She brought her 2 daughters, and they placed their belongings in rooms my children had decorated. They moved the kids into different spaces, redecorated, rearranged, as if erasing us. The house went from being mine to being theirs in less than a week. And for a few nights, I lay awake thinking, maybe I should have fought harder. Maybe I should have stayed longer. Maybe I should have endured more. Because watching another woman live in your former life does something violent to your psyche. But then something happened that clarified everything. 9 months after I left, I couldn't keep up financially anymore. Between legal fees, rent, childcare, and law school, I was drowning. So at 37 years old, I moved back in with my parents, with my 2 children, boxes stacked in my childhood bedroom. And the shame I had tried to avoid by staying in that marriage, it met me there anyway. The dream I had clung to, the house, the stability, the image, had dissolved. I had stayed to avoid embarrassment. And I ended up back in my parents' house with 2 kids and a contested divorce. The irony was brutal. But then came the moment that shifted everything. Exactly 1 year after I left that house. To the day. I was diagnosed with breast cancer. The doctor's voice was steady, professional. We need to start treatment immediately. I expected to fall apart. I expected to feel devastated. Instead, something strange happened. The desire to disappear left my body. All those nights years earlier when I thought, if he died, this would be easier. If I died, I wouldn't have to explain. Gone. Replaced by something ferocious. I looked at the doctor and said, "What's the plan?" Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. I scheduled everything around law school, around my children, around the life I was rebuilding. I sat in classrooms with a scarf over my head while IV marks bruised my arms. I interned at a family law office between treatments. I studied for exams while nauseous. I passed the bar before graduation. And every time my body felt like it was breaking, I repeated one sentence. I will never go back to that life. Cancer didn't scare me the way marriage had, because cancer was honest. Marriage had been deceptive. Cancer said fight. Marriage had said endure. And I was done enduring. During treatment, I watched my children closely. They didn't care about the house. They didn't care about the neighborhood. They cared that I was present, that I read bedtime stories, that I showed up at school events, even bald. And that's when I realized the biggest lie I had believed. I had stayed in a loveless marriage to protect them, but what they needed wasn't an intact house. It was an intact mother. When I finally passed the bar and opened my small office in a co-working space, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, grounded. I had rebuilt from nothing. I had survived humiliation, illness, financial collapse, and the worst part? He thought I would crumble. He thought I would beg. He thought I would fail without his infrastructure. But I didn't. And here's the part that still unsettles me. He eventually lost the house. The bank repossessed it. The dream he clung to dissolved too. And I had walked away from it willingly. Sometimes freedom doesn't look glamorous. It looks like a tiny apartment. Like chemo appointments. Like student loans. Like studying at midnight. But it also looks like self-respect. And when I look back at those 40 days, the escalation, the humiliation, the restaurant, the moving truck, I understand something clearly now. The marriage was sexless, but he wasn't. And the real betrayal wasn't the affairs. It was the way he expected me to shrink quietly while he expanded. He underestimated one thing. I was done shrinking. When the doctor said the word cancer, the room didn't spin. It sharpened. People expect tears, collapse, panic. What I felt was clarity. Exactly 1 year earlier, I had packed a moving truck and left the house where my marriage died slowly. Exactly 1 year earlier, I had chosen uncertainty over humiliation. And now, sitting in a sterile office with fluorescent lighting and pamphlets about survival rates, I understood something with terrifying precision. I had already survived something worse than this. Marriage had hollowed me out quietly. Cancer was loud. Marriage had whispered, "Stay small." Cancer demanded, "Fight." There's something brutally honest about a diagnosis. It doesn't gaslight you. It doesn't pretend. It doesn't twist narratives. It says, "This is what we're dealing with." I respected that. The first chemo session was colder than I expected. Not emotionally, physically. The IV slid into my arm. The drip started. I watched the fluid enter my body and thought about all the years I had let poison enter in quieter ways. Humiliation, silence, self-erasure. At least this poison had a purpose. I scheduled treatments around law school. Yes, law school. People asked if I was insane. Take a break, they said. Focus on your health. Rest. But I knew something about myself by then. If I stopped moving forward, my mind would spiral backward. And I refused to go back. I attended lectures with a scarf wrapped tightly around my head. The first time a classmate offered me a sympathetic look, I almost laughed. They saw a sick woman trying to finish school. They didn't see a woman who had already rebuilt herself from the inside out. I interned at a family law office between treatments, sitting across from women who whispered stories of cheating husbands, emotional neglect, financial control, psychological abuse, and every time one of them said, "I don't know if I'm overreacting," I felt something steady rise in my chest. No, you're not. I didn't just understand the paperwork. I understood the paralysis, the shame, the way you negotiate with yourself for years. Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe I can survive this. Maybe I'm asking for too much. I had lived that script. Now I was rewriting it. There were nights during chemo when my bones ached so deeply I couldn't sleep. I would lie in the dark at my parents' house, back in the same room I had grown up in, and stare at the ceiling. My children slept down the hall. My mother would check on me quietly, thinking I didn't notice. And in those hours, I made promises to myself. If I survive this, I will never accept half love again. If I survive this, I will never shrink to preserve someone else's comfort. If I survive this, my children will see strength, not endurance. The physical changes were brutal. Hair fell out in clumps. My reflection shifted week by week. But here's the strange part. For the first time in years, I recognized myself. Not the polished version, not the married version, not the cool wife version. The raw version. The woman who had wanted love and mistakenly believed it required self-sacrifice. Cancer stripped me physically. Divorce stripped me socially. And somewhere in that double stripping, I became honest. I passed the bar exam before graduation. I remember opening the results email in the hospital parking lot after a treatment. Hands shaking, not from weakness, but from adrenaline. I had done it. Not because it was easy, because I refused to be dependent ever again. Financial independence isn't about money. It's about permission. Permission to leave. Permission to choose. Permission to say no. When I opened my tiny office in a co-working space, it wasn't glamorous. No mahogany desk, no skyline view. Just a rented room, a used chair, and a second-hand filing cabinet. But it was mine. Every woman who walked through that door carried a story. And I listened differently, because I wasn't just hearing legal facts. I was hearing internal negotiations. I don't want to ruin my kids' lives. I don't want to embarrass my parents. I don't know if I can afford to leave. He's not abusive. He just doesn't touch me. He just talks to other women. He just makes me feel small. He just lives a life that doesn't include me. There's a violence in invisibility. It doesn't bruise the skin. It erodes the self. And I started telling women something I wish someone had told me sooner. Endurance is not the same as strength. Sometimes strength is leaving. Even when it's humiliating. Even when it's financially terrifying. Even when you have to move back into your parents' house at 37. Even when you lose the house with 7 televisions. Even when your ex replaces you in weeks. Especially then. During one particularly rough treatment cycle, the cancer spread. Metastasis. Another round of chemo. More surgeries. More nights staring at ceilings. And yet, the fear I felt wasn't about death. It was about unfinished business. I wanted my children to grow up watching a mother who rebuilt, not one who stayed broken. And so I worked. Through nausea. Through fatigue. Through surgeries. Through doubt. Not recklessly. Intentionally. Rebuilding wasn't about revenge. It was about alignment. When the house he stayed in was eventually repossessed by the bank, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt detached. That house had been an illusion. And illusions don't last. What lasts is character. And I had finally started building mine intentionally. The first time I signed a lease on a home I could afford on my own, I cried. Not because it was big. It wasn't. Not because it was luxurious. It wasn't. But because it was stable. Earned. Real. My children picked their own rooms. Hung posters. Placed stuffed animals on beds that weren't temporary. And for the first time since the divorce, I slept deeply. No waiting for footsteps. No whispering behind bathroom doors. No checking phone records. Just quiet. Honest quiet. I didn't know then that love would find me again in the most unexpected way. But I did know something had fundamentally changed. I no longer wanted a marriage to complete a dream. I wanted partnership, respect, presence. I wanted to be seen. And more importantly, I had learned how to see myself. The marriage had been sexless, but he wasn't. And for years, I thought that was the deepest betrayal. Now I understand it wasn't. The deepest betrayal was abandoning myself to preserve a structure. Cancer forced me to return to myself. Divorce forced me to rebuild. And somewhere in that rebuilding, I became a woman I actually recognized. Not the girl walking down the aisle chasing an idea. Not the wife smiling through loneliness. Not the mother enduring for optics. A woman who chose, even when choosing hurt. There's a moment after survival when you realize you're not surviving anymore. You're living. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't cinematic. It was gradual. The first time I bought groceries without calculating whether I could afford gas the same week. The first time my children invited friends over without asking, "Are we moving again?" The first time I sat in my office across from a woman who whispered, "I don't know if I'm strong enough." And I heard myself respond, "You are." And meant it. Rebuilding wasn't glamorous. It was administrative, paperwork, client meetings, late nights drafting custody agreements, Saturday mornings in court, Sunday afternoons reviewing case files while my kids watched movies beside me. But there was a rhythm to it, an honesty, no double life, no whispers behind doors, no pretending. And then, when I least expected it, when I had finally stopped searching for proof that I was lovable, it happened. I met someone, not in a hospital, not in a courtroom, not through friends trying to set me up, in a bar, on a night I almost didn't go out. I remember thinking I was too tired, too busy, too practical, but I went anyway. And he asked me a question no one had asked me in years. "What time can I pick you up?" Pick me up, not meet me there, not text me when you're free, not we'll see. There was certainty in the question. It was small, but I noticed it. His name was Daniel. He lived miles away, far enough that convenience couldn't be the foundation. He had children too, 3 of them. And when we started talking about our lives, he didn't flinch at mine. He didn't minimize it. He didn't romanticize it either. He listened. Actually listened. When I told him about my divorce, he didn't say, "That must have been hard." He said, "You must have felt alone." That difference matters. Loneliness inside a marriage is different from loneliness outside one. He understood that. The first time I cried in front of him, I braced for discomfort, for awkwardness, for that subtle shift men sometimes have when they don't know what to do with a woman's tears. Instead, he stayed. No jokes, no deflection, no telling me it was funny or dramatic. He stayed, and I realized something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. This is what partnership feels like. Not intensity, not chaos, not control, presence, steadiness, respect. Our relationship wasn't built on rescuing each other. It was built on recognition. We had both survived marriages that fractured us. We weren't looking for saviors. We were looking for alignment. When his children came into my life, I didn't hesitate. Not because I was naive, because I had already learned the cost of pretending. 5 children in one house, noise, schedules, homework, shared meals, different personalities colliding. And yet, peace. Not perfection. Peace. There's a difference. The first time Daniel brought me flowers, it wasn't for an anniversary. It was because he saw them and thought of me. I cried in the kitchen holding them. Because no one had thought of me like that in years. He knew my favorite color, my favorite coffee order, the way I like the house quiet in the mornings. He noticed. And for the first time, I wasn't invisible. That's what healthy love feels like. Not fireworks, visibility. There's something else I want to say clearly. My life now isn't a fairy tale reward for suffering. It's the result of decisions. Hard ones. Uncomfortable ones. Humiliating ones. Leaving when it would have been easier to stay. Studying when it would have been easier to rest. Choosing independence when dependence felt safer. And here's the truth I didn't understand at 27. Marriage doesn't validate you. Children don't complete you. Status doesn't protect you. Only self-respect does. The marriage was sexless, but he wasn't. And for years, I believed that was the ultimate betrayal. Now I know better. The ultimate betrayal would have been staying small forever. I don't hate him. That surprises people. I don't feel the need to. He is who he is, and I am who I became. Sometimes women ask me, "Do you regret staying as long as you did?" I don't. Because I learned something in that endurance. I learned what I will never tolerate again. And I learned that surviving something doesn't mean you're meant to remain in it. My children see me differently now, not as the woman who stayed, but as the woman who rebuilt. And when they ask about love, I don't tell them fairy tales. I tell them this: love should feel safe. Respect should feel natural. And if you ever feel yourself disappearing, listen to that. Because I didn't. And I lost years. But I didn't lose myself permanently. That's the part that matters. You can rebuild after humiliation. You can rebuild after divorce. You can rebuild after illness. You can rebuild after believing the wrong version of your own story. I did. And the life he thought I couldn't sustain without him, I built it anyway. If you're watching this and something in this story felt uncomfortably familiar, I need you to hear this. Loneliness inside a marriage is not a personality flaw. It's a signal. You are not dramatic for wanting to be touched, seen, chosen. And you are not weak for staying longer than you should have. But you are powerful when you decide you're done shrinking. This channel exists for stories like this, for the things marriages hide, for the quiet humiliations, for the women who survived them. If this story moved you, follow the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever felt like you were disappearing in a relationship, stay close. You're not alone here. And sometimes clarity begins with a story that sounds a little too familiar.